I think ultimately it's about risk. Like, what are the riskiest, most scary things to our organization, and then how do we buy down that risk, ideally in as sort of sustainable and scalable way as possible.
Yeah. Hi, you're listening to The Secure Developer. It's part of the My DevSecOps community, a platform for developers, operators, and security people to share their views and practices on DevSecOps, Dev and Sec collaboration, cloud security, and more. Check out mydevsecops.io to join the community and find other great resources. This podcast is sponsored by Snyk. Snyk is a dev-first security company helping companies fix vulnerabilities in open source components and containers without slowing down development. To learn more, visit snyk.io. On today's episode, Guy Podjarny, president and co-founder of Snyk, talks to Clint Gibler at DevSecCon Seattle. Clint has an extensive background in helping companies implement security automation and DevSecOps best practices, as well as perform penetration tests for companies ranging from large enterprise to new startups. He's the co-founder of Practical Program Analysis, LLC, helping companies scale their security efforts through cutting-edge tools and processes, as well as a research director for NCC Group, a global information assurance specialist providing organizations with security consulting services.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to The Secure Developer. Today we have another DevSecCon special edition version of it, and we have with us Clint Gibler. Clint, welcome to the show.
Hey there. Thank you so much for having me.
So, Clint, before we dig into the details, tell us a little bit about yourself. What is it that you do?
Sure. So I'm a technical director and research director at NCC Group. We do security consulting and mostly penetration testing of web apps, network, mobile, and so forth. But we've also been doing more work in security engineering and security automation and DevSecOps. And many of our clients are thinking about these sorts of challenges. And so we're learning the best way to help them.
Got it. And this is like coming into an existing organization. They might have security practices, so they have their security people, but you're coming along to help them kind of evolve the practice, if you will?
Yes, perhaps they're a small team and they're having to support a much bigger development team. So how do we scale our efforts? Or we have some security engineers and we want to know what is the best, most effective way to sort of spend our time. So yeah, and sometimes we build things as well.
What's your, we're going to get into the panel you moderate in a second there, but what's your current kind of best tip, when you engage with a customer? I know every customer is different and all those, but what's a repetitive bit of advice that you see that kind of comes up when you do these engagements recently?
Yeah, so I think one thing that I see is people have a specific thing that they think they should do, such as using static analysis tools like SAST or dynamic analysis tools like DAST. And people get very focused on, how do I do X better? When I think a better question is what sort of risks are you trying to mitigate? What problems are you trying to solve? And then figure out what is the best approach to do that, right? So starting from what are the requirements and outcomes that you want, and then figure out the best way to get there rather than sort of starting with the solution and then trying to make that better, because that might not actually be the best way to do it. Different vulnerability classes are better at either finding or preventing with different techniques. So yeah, I would say that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good bit. And it actually came up in the panel yesterday, right? We talked about, what was it? I think Netflix, right? We're sort of, doing a big DAS project, but not, kind of starting from the end a little bit, and saying, what does success look like in this context? So I guess even the best fall for that trap sometimes.
Yeah, Asta originally mentioned that at our AppSec Calais panel last year, and I found that very interesting. Because, they build and release all these amazing tools, and it's sort of inspiring or at least comforting that even the best make mistakes like this.
So let's dig into the panel. You had, a very esteemed panel that you moderated yesterday, with just sort of great, I guess, forward-thinking security leads. And generally, we're going to post the sort of the YouTube link, as part of this show, and very much recommend everybody to watch the whole thing. What would you say, like you're there, you're on the panel, you ask some questions. Sometimes on panels, you get this like uniform, everybody agrees, you find yourself 5 echoes, phrasing the same thing at the same time, while other questions kind of unravel more debate, right? Or more, people don't really have that solved yet. What was your impression in the panel that went yesterday? Which topics do you think were more uniform and people just need to implement them, just being a tricky word over there? It's about execution, versus which ones we're just not quite sure how to go about doing them yet.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so before the panel, we all talked and we wanted to make sure that it wasn't just blindly agreeing on everything, because ideally having some differences shows the nuance between how different organizations with different cultures view the same thing. Everyone here is smart and has good teams, so where are the cases when smart people disagree? And we thought that was very interesting. Despite our best efforts, there was a lot of agreement about many things. So I think some common principles or sort of mindsets that are generally the case are working with developers to enable them, right? So you have to build guardrails, not be gatekeepers.
Yeah.
Because fundamentally, development teams are building products that make the business money. So our job as security people is to make them be moving very quickly and effectively, but also safely, right? So I think historically, there's definitely been a culture of, security saying no, but I think Zane said it very well on the panel when he said previously where security may say yes once a year, now you have to say no once a year. And that is a thing I see in a lot of successful organizations where the security team, occasionally you can have one or two things that you sort of hard block and say no on, but those really have to be like, this is the hill I'm going to die on. This can't be done. So I would say that investing in security automation. So, CI/CD and DevOps, there's all these tools that are making development very quick and releasing very quick. And so if you can sort of insert security visibility points or hooks and checks like throughout this existing infrastructure, that can be very powerful. And companies have gotten a lot of value from that. In terms of some of the differences, I think there's some differing views on how valuable security partnerships are and security champions. So I think everyone agrees that it's valuable and important to have close relationships with the development team. They need to be comfortable coming to you with like, hey, I don't know if this is an issue or not. Can you advise me? But I think the question is like, how much do you prioritize that, right? So let's say you have an AppSec team of, say, 3 to 6 people, which is common or even large in many organizations, supporting hundreds of engineers. So if you have a finite amount of time and you have, say, tens of teams, you can't easily have significant one-on-one personal relationships with like all of those teams. And for Netflix, for example, as they continue to grow and grow, if I'm recalling correctly, they thought that, yes, these personal connections are helpful, but it's like maybe there are several key teams that you need to be really close with, and you have sort of looser tabs on other things. And you sort of make up the scale with sort of security automation giving you continuous visibility into the state and relative risk of different systems. So everyone thinks partnering with development teams is important and crucial, but sort of how much you weigh the in-person one-on-one relationships versus, say, libraries and automation, I think that was a difference based on
different
where
people
you come from.
Yeah. And I guess, it does depend at the end of the day on sort of different cultures and what works in their surroundings, and maybe the two are sort of not mutually exclusive. Definitely, at a certain size of organization, you're suddenly, the size of 10 other companies that might be on the, on the panel, and you may need both. You may need your sort of, your champions and your people advocating those tools and automation that is there, or being a knowledge hub.
And I think culture is a big part of that as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the emphasis on culture seemed to also resonate a lot. One point that I was a little bit surprised didn't come up, maybe didn't get as much support, is I think Julianne was referring to sort of celebrating successes. There was no dissent about it. Everybody was agreeing about it. But I don't know, like, should that have come up more in the conversation? Did I just kind of misread it? Or do you find that's a topic that people agree on? Or is it sort of still hit and miss?
Yeah, I think celebrating success is very important. Yeah, I think we didn't talk about it too much, but I think there's pretty strong consensus there in terms of not only building good relationships and not being sort of the security boogeyman, but also, like going to security teams and bringing, a pie or cupcakes and saying, hey, we remediated all of our critical high, medium, and lows, everything clean bill of health. We hit it within SLAs, let's have a little mini party and sort of hold people up as a success to the rest of the organization, and just being very positive about, I know a Segment, for example, I have a couple of friends there, and they have a nice security team within their rapidly growing startup. And they have sort of like an internal security leaderboard in terms of, this developer just, fixed a bunch of important security issues or brought to our attention some things we needed. And they've actively been celebrating this. And it's had a huge cultural value in terms of just getting everyone passionate and excited about security. I think we chatted in previous panels a little bit more about celebrating successes, and then maybe our subconscious is like, we've already chatted about this. But yeah, I think there's a lot of room for innovation in how you celebrate and win. But yeah, celebrate security wins. But yeah, I think that's very valuable and nice to do.
One of the topics that, I kind of lobbed that question a little bit around the sort of measuring security and understanding it. Definitely no crisp answers. Like I think every panelist started by saying it's hard. How do you see, whether it's the answers or other insights, you're very much on top of the world. What do you think is the state of the art today around measuring security and how well you're doing, right? Like a security team measuring whether they're doing their job right or not. What are there key insights in the panel that you want to draw kind of attention to?
I thought that was an excellent question for the panel, and I appreciated that question, so thank you.
I try to make things hard.
Yeah, the panel members look to each other and, ooh. Yeah, so I think this is something we should be thinking more about as a security industry. I think it's a bit of a failure on our part, to be honest. If you think of other industries, for example, like marketing or sales or things like that, there's very clear metrics for success, right? If you went to your marketing team and they were like, we spent $10 million, and you're like, great, how useful was that in terms of, getting us new leads or whatever? And they were like, trust us, right? You wouldn't have a lot of confidence in them, but in security, we're like, oh, just trust us. Like things are better now. So I think it's very important to delve more deeply into this. So I guess one of the things we mentioned, keeping track of just simply like number of vulnerabilities and what severity can be misleading as you roll out additional detection tools or just get better from maybe you previously didn't tag issues in Jira, for example, security issues, and then you start doing that. And all of a sudden now your dashboards are like, oh, look how many vulnerabilities we have. So basically getting better visibility and integrating new tools that are better may make you look worse if you're only focusing on, say, like one-dimensional number of bugs and how severe are they. But I think that you still want to capture things like that. So we actually had a dinner with most of the panel afterwards, and someone, I think Zane was sort of calling out, this is like a bad metric. But then I think Hongi and I were arguing like, well, like, yes, that in itself is not a useful metric. However, you need that information in order to say, for example, we have a lot of XSS, so let's systematically try to eliminate that. So I think we all agree that you should capture that information, but how much value and importance you place on it and how it's used, sort of there's some nuance there that's not obvious.
Yeah.
I think in Agile, sort of the manifesto, how do you like time to detection and time to fix? I think that's a very important metric. And there was another talk, they're talking about the OODA loop, right? So if you can detect that an attack is happening and respond faster than they can successfully exploit it, then that significantly reduces the risk.
Yeah.
Zane, in his Black Hat talk from a year or two ago, had an excellent story of where they instrumented an alert in JavaScript so that if it fired on their site, it would send telemetry back to them. And they actually saw that trigger, they fixed the XSS before the bug bounty person reported it. and much to that person's chagrin.
A different type of exploit, I guess, on the
which I thought was very funny. So I think ultimately it comes down to risk. Some innovation in the space that's been happening is companies are working on like automatically, like programmatically inferring risk of various services based on various factors you can infer. So, for example, is this internet facing? Is it critical to the business? Mm-hmm. If this is like an AWS instance, like how many of them are there? Like this service is represented in like one or two live nodes versus like thousands. Is it touching sensitive PII of what classes? So there's, I think, risk models you can generate programmatically, and you also can hook that into like historical vulnerability data to say, oh, this is both critical to the business and tends to have issues. So maybe we focus more there, or maybe there's live issues. Yeah,
it's all about the sort of the combination of all the signals that you have available. I found first of all, I found it very insightful, kind of like your comment on, again, it's simple, but the fact that, you're sort of incentivized. If you're incentivized to just keep the number of vulnerabilities that are currently open at the lowest number, then you're basically incentivized not to find any more. So, it is like a little bit of a thing to cope with, as you do want to increase your understanding, but it also is very understood how, your KPIs might look, much terrible there. I do find, one of the comments that I think Asta made was how they didn't really have a sharp answer off the cuff on how they measure security posture, but what they do measure well is just the delivery on the projects that they've chosen to do. So I think maybe that's in line with what you're suggesting over here, which is, okay, like if we're going to reduce, we took on a project, we decided maybe a little bit more loosely that cross-site scripting is an important risk to tackle, but then there are concrete measures about how do we indeed reduce that level. She was talking about delivering on the roadmap and the likes. So I found that, kind of a good model, as well as the comment, I think, from Zane. We kind of keep quoting him over here, on just starting from a mindset of saying, how would the attackers succeed? If I were an attacker, how likely is the attacker to succeed in penetrating malware, and just starting from that perspective versus from what can I measure, and then try to sort of break it back down into what you can measure.
Yeah, I think ultimately it's about risk. Like, what are the riskiest, most scary things to our organization, and then how do we buy down that risk, ideally in as sort of sustainable and scalable way as possible.
Yeah. So maybe a couple more questions. One is, you were really, really adept at the panel at kind of mentioning that this person here had that talk and this person there, had that talk on relevant topics that came up. How do you keep up? How do you advise people, stay up to date on these types of interesting evolutions in DevSecOps or otherwise sort of security?
Thank you. Yeah. So the honest answer is I've spent hundreds of hours watching talks, reading blog posts, and just chatting with friends like over drinks. Yeah, I think there's too much out there to really be abreast of everything. So I think it's helpful to come up with like a handful of topics that so if, for example, you want to be very familiar with one area, just like sort of acknowledging to yourself that you're not going to be an expert in everything, and then just really focusing on that. Like for me, for example, I'm really interested in automated bug finding and DevSecOps and sort of modern AppSec practices. So different conferences tend to have more content in certain specific areas. So for me, the various OWASP ones, like AppSec Cali and EU and Global. And then obviously there's like a number of other ones besides SF, and others are good as well. I think if you find individual people who give a talk that you think is very good, looking for other work that they've done. Yep. Like actually before this week, I watched like 5 talks from Julian because I was like, oh, this guy knows what's up.
Yeah.
And I would say, I think it's challenging. One challenge, so I have a bit of an academic background, and I think that one thing academia does better than industry is being aware of related work. I think there's a lot of redoing work, or at least like if you were to draw a Venn diagram, it's like 80% overlap between a lot of industry talks, which is fine. I think there's unique value there, but I think less time and attention is spent on being aware of what other people are doing. So I'm like actively trying to do that. But again, that takes time and it's hard. So
that's a great practice though, if people do, if they had like a references slide at the end of every talk, that would be.
And some people do, and I try to. I think that's awesome. And partly to sort of help people with this challenge, I've started a sort of application security and DevSecOps newsletter, just super informal, just like, hey, here's a couple of talks I watched. I think these are the best in the space, and here's maybe like a couple of bullet points or a 1 or 2 page summary of it so that you can sort of quickly get the main points, see the key slides and figures, and ideally save some time and help you be better and more efficient.
That sounds super useful. Where can you find that newsletter?
Yeah, so it's at Program Analysis. So the .is is the name. It's the Iceland registrar.
Yeah.
So Program Analysis, so the .is and then /newsletter. Yeah, and it's like once a month or once every other week or so. Just, hey, here's the most useful links I've come across. Yep. Here's some talks I really like. For example, like Arkady Tettleman, who was at Airbnb, gave a really good talk on data-driven bug bounty, where he showed how Airbnb used that information to basically invest in the right security engineering efforts to sort of really buy down risk, is one thing that I wrote about. But yeah, so
cool. Now I want to watch that talk on the. I love, thanks for writing the newsletters. I feel all of it. It's like a lot of my content consumption comes from newsletters. Just trusting other people's opinions to sort of filter the internet, and you find the right one. So very much advise people to go check it out. And thank you for sort of spending the time doing that curation. I think is always kind of a good deed for sort of evangelizing knowledge. So Clint, before I kind of, let you go here, we've been going kind of long, as I'm kind of known to do a little bit. You moderated the panel, that's great. You get an opportunity to answer some of the questions yourself as well. But if you were on the panel, if you had kind of an insight, an opportunity to share just a thought, choose the question, what's an insight or a perspective that you would have liked to share?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one thing I've seen, so just at NCC Group, we're working with clients a couple of times. Clients have said, hey, we're trying to use SAST or we're trying to use DAST, help us make it better. And I think that there's definitely room for improving and tuning all of these tools in terms of, reducing false positives, increasing signal and things like that. But I think that it's useful to think about, just take a step back from the very tactical view and think, what are we trying to do here? What risks are we trying to either buy down or mitigate or reduce or ideally even remove? Mm-hmm. Because when you think of like, okay, how do I make, say, this static analysis tool better? generally you can, but that might not be the best technique for finding a specific vulnerability class, for example. So I think companies that are very in the weeds thinking like, okay, how do I use this tool better? I would encourage them to at least spend some time stepping back and thinking, what are all of the different issues that our company is facing? If you were to say graph, here's all the vulnerabilities we had over the past 1 to 2 years, group them in a vulnerability class, like XSS, SSRF, CSRF, things like that. Yeah. And then saying, okay, what are we seeing? What is the relative impact? And then what is the best approach to solve that issue? And I think the primary tools in your tool belt are probably, building a secure wrapper library, lightweight static analysis or lightweight dynamic analysis. And different vulnerability classes are better or worse suited to based on your tech stack as well as the specific vulnerability. So yeah, I would say just take a step back, rather than saying, how do we make this tool or this process better? Think, is that even the right thing we should be doing? Right? Because an amazing world-class hammer is probably not the best tool to put in a screw. Right? So that would be my advice.
It's a really, really good advice. I guess you get an opportunity over here to share it. Hopefully you get more stages. Clint, this has been a pleasure. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
And thanks everybody for tuning in. And I hope you join us for the next one.
Thanks for listening to The Secure Developer. That's all we have time for today. For additional episodes and full transcriptions, visit mydevsecops.io. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or get involved in the community, you can also find us on Twitter at @mydevsecops. Don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes if you enjoyed today's episode. Bye for now.